Welcome back to Button Pushers. I'm Ben,
I'm Meg. Hello.
and this week we're going to continue the conversation about digital imaging. And I know that we've previously discussed some stuff about exposure indicators. We're going to now talk more on the technique side about how to make those changes to get the exposure indicator that we want.
Yeah. Obviously, I think most people, when they think exposure, the first thing they're going to think is mass. And I mean, mass is truly one of the first ways that we can change our IR exposure. So if you look at the ART specs, that's basically what we're looking at today. It's basically that whole first column going over all the different factors that can change our EI value. First one being at the top of the list is mass. But mass is super important because mass directly corresponds with our patient dose. So if we can change our mass, we can, and when I say change, I mean lower. When we lower our mass, we're going to lower our patient dose. Now, this kind of ties into the 15% rule, right? So, and this is something that we're really trying to hone in on. By increasing your KVP by 15% and having your mass, you're going to be able to maintain your DI of hopefully 0. So we want to get away from everyone being these button pushers, right? And just taking these pictures with the APR or AEC, getting a picture that's in the green and sending it when they can be applying that 15% rule and decreasing our patient dose even more. So mass, quantity of our beam, we can reduce it, increase our quality of our beam by increasing KVP. We're saving our patient dose. And especially now with digital, with windowing and leveling, we can change if the picture looks a little under-penetrated or over-penetrated by looking at the windowing and leveling. Not saving it like that, right? We don't want to save it and send it to the fax that way, but take your picture. You can make sure all the information's on there. You don't have quantum model or oversaturation, and then you can, save patient dose, 15% rule. Gold
And
standard.
that's kind of what Dr. Millman Marsh was talking about, was making sure that we understand that we can't just look at a deviation indicator and say, oh, it's green, it's good. Mm-hmm. We have to think about what are those other things, like does the patient have a hip replacement, or is there motion on here? So, or, because there are a number of things that if those factors aren't set up correctly, we might get a green light on an image that's not good.
Totally, yeah. So that's when we have to be not just, technologists, we also, it's an art and a science, right? Mm-hmm. You have to be able to look at that and say, how else can I make it better? Not just, send it just because it's green. Think about 15% rule. Think about ways you can save patient dose. So another thing, just because we're talking about ways to increase IR exposure, yes, mass is going to be one of the quickest, easiest ways to increase our IR exposure. If you're in the negative yellows and you need to get into that green, you're at the -3, you want to get to a DI of 0, increasing mass is going to be the quickest, easiest way to do it. The other way you can do it is KVP, right? KVP is better in terms of saving on patient dose. It does increase patient dose, though. I don't want to say that increasing KVP does not increase patient dose. It does, but not nearly as dramatically as mass. So if I had to choose between increasing KVP or increasing mass, I choose KVP all day long because it doesn't affect our scale of contrast like it used to with film. With film, you knew your special KVP for each film, like view, and you didn't touch it, 70 for a knee, period, end of story. And now we can take knee x-rays at like 90 kVp and it doesn't matter. It's not going to make it into, a long scale image. It's still going to be short scale. So it's kind of cool stuff that we can do here. So mass, KVP, I talked about the two main factors that we talked about. The other one would be OID, right? So that's not one that most people think about that changes our IR exposure. Whenever I think OID, I think air gap technique. So a lot of students mess this up. I don't know what they're constantly thinking about where it is and what happens. If you always think OID and think air gap technique, you'll think about all the factors. So I think about the lateral C-spine, right? Lateral C-spine is going to have air gap technique. As soon as that x-ray is coming in and hitting your C-spine or your neck or whatever it hits, as your x-ray is coming in, it's hitting something, my film's over here, as soon as that x-ray hits anything, it's going to start scattering. So if I have this air gap technique, I'm allowing it to not hit the image receptor right away. I'm allowing it to possibly skip and miss the image receptor, adding to scatter in the room, right? So that's something we have to keep in mind and why we need to be far away. But it's going to reduce our scatter to the image receptor, but scatter adds IR exposure. So when we have scatter missing the image receptor, sure, contrast goes up and that's great, but we have to increase our technique to compensate for that because we're going to lose IR exposure. So, and we're going to have magnification, but that's a whole nother story. When you have magnification, increased distortion, spatial resolution goes down. So no bueno on that part. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that even those changes in the expected size of the part can influence the deviation indicator or the exposure indicator because it's influencing the shape and pattern of the histogram. And so if it gets an unexpected histogram, it may not give you an appropriate reading for the for an exposure indicator or deviation index.
Very true. Kind of going back to what we were just talking about last episode, how you have to be on the right view in order to have the right histogram being pulled up as a reference histogram. So good point. Yeah. Yeah. Anytime I think OID, I think about the air gap technique and I think about grids. So it has the same effect as grids do. It cleans up scatter, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I think, is it Quinn Carroll or Carol Quinn?
Quinn Carroll, yeah.
It's like Elton John. Like for me, it's one of those names. It's like Bob Dylan. Like, which is your first name? Which is your last name?
Like Benjamin Roberts. You don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, Benjamin Roberts. Right. Embarrassing. That happens to me every time. But one of the things he talks about is how no amount of mass will compensate for insufficient KVP. So there's a minimum amount of KVP that's needed for imaging. But now that we have such a wide dynamic range of response using digital, we don't really have a maximum KVP as long as we're still inside the diagnostic range of energies. So
which the dynamic range in digital is huge now.
Right. Yeah. It's huge. And the contrast resolution of digital is huge because of windowing and leveling. So we can use that, to your point, and we can increase our KVP to levels that we would not want to have used in film because we had such a narrow dynamic range. But as we do that, as we're increasing the KVP, we're going to need to apply the 15% rule to make appropriate reductions in our mass. So the 15% rule still holds, even though some of the other stuff has changed. So if, for example, I normally shot a knee at, I don't know, just 80 KVP and 5 mass, for example, and I want to increase that KVP, I would apply the 15% rule, figure out what 15% of 80 is. And there's some nice little math shortcuts I can throw up on the screen to give you all an idea of what are some shortcuts for calculating that in your head. And then make an appropriate reduction in mass. Even though I will reduce patient exposure a little bit in doing that. But it's still largely the reduction in patient exposure is because the average energy of the X-ray beam has increased. And so maybe slightly more of the photons are flying through the patient without interacting.
Increasing OID is going to decrease your scatter, increase your contrast, decrease IR exposure, and it's going to increase magnification. One way that you can bring that back down is increase SID, right? So if you ever do have a huge OID, increase your SID, and you're going to decrease your magnification factor. But going back to SID, if we just do SID alone, not only does it reduce magnification, that's why we do a chest at 72, but also it's going to decrease our IR exposure. And that goes back to inverse square law, direct square law, right? So as we increase our SID, we're going to decrease our IR exposure. If I have a SID of 40 inches compared to 20 inches, 20 inches, I'm going to have 4 times more dose in that area than at 40 inches. A lot of people think if I half my distance, I half my IR exposure. It's not that. It's actually the opposite. I'm doing 4 times more dose when I half my SID. So that's why we do the inverse square law and direct square law, is to figure out when we increase our SID, what kind of new technique we need to compensate for that loss of intensity.
Yeah.
But less magnification, so that's a good thing. Better spatial resolution. Okay, so that was that. If we keep going down the ART specs, the next thing on there is grids, right? Mm-hmm. That's a fun one. Have you been reading all the articles? Like, I feel like grids are gonna be like totally worthless in like 5 years.
Yeah, again, that was one that Quinn Carroll predicted. He had an ASRT presentation, I think it was in 2018, where he was like, grids are useless. Yeah. And here's the science behind why they're useless. Yeah, I agree. I think grids are on their way out the door, and I won't really miss them very much. Because the thing with grids is you will get a prettier picture in terms of contrast, but you're going to be doing it at the expense of patient dose, and it's a significant increase in patient dose. Yeah. Plus, with the digital systems, there is a potential to create some kind of artifact, which sometimes can be difficult to detect with the human eye, but it's going to be apparent to the physician when they look at it with the nicer monitor. I
think we should wrap it up here and maybe dive into some more of this next time.